Hello, and welcome back again to Politics and Societies of Southeast Europe. In the last two segments, we talked about um, socialism and the operation of markets and consumerism under socialism, and some of the dilemmas and contradictions of the way that socialism operated. To the degree that state socialist regimes can be called socialist, then socialist rule came to an end around 1989 or so with the changes of regimes in the states of the region. And we are now in a period that is often labeled as post-socialist. I want to talk a little bit about what that means and what are some of the consequences of so-called post-socialism. First, however, I want to raise some issues and some questions that are indicated by the use of this term, post-socialism. Although the term post-socialism is used frequently, it is an imprecise term, and it's not entirely clear to what it refers. Does it refer to a time, everything that happened after 1989 or 1990? Does it refer to a place, a part of the world, where the states and the economies and the regimes are post-socialist? Does it refer to an ideology, a set of goals and purposes that are associated with the condition of once having had a state socialist regime? Does it refer to a condition, a set of circumstances that are faced by all of the states and societies that are confronted by post-socialism? And if there is a post-socialist condition or a post-socialist place or a post-socialist period, how long does it remain post-socialist? Does this post-socialist period have an end? And if it does have an end, what is supposed to come after it? What is also important, I think, in the post-socialist period is that a lot of what happens in the present is structured by understandings of the past. And a lot of the understandings of the past that are promoted become resources in the development of understandings of the present. That is to say, how people talk about the socialist period and the period after socialism probably indicates less what they thought about the period of state socialism and indicates more about what they think about the period that they are living in now. Particularly to the extent that all of these perceptions are structured by some kind of general overall statement about whether they think the present is better or worse than the past. When we talk about this past, what are the elements of the past that we talk about? What is important about the regimes of state socialism? Is it the degree to which these were authoritarian states? Is it the degree to which there were states that promoted equality or preserved a certain kind of social peace for a while? Is it something good or something bad? Possibly what this depends, what you're going to emphasize about the period of state socialism depends on who you are and how you are positioned in the present. And so a lot of political conflicts in post-socialist states and societies continue to be structured by differing orientations toward the period of state socialism. Then there are the elements of both positive and negative nostalgia. When we talk about negative nostalgia, we very often talk about the repression and other types of violence, whether it was social or material violence committed by socialist states, and the way that this information becomes public, how and why does discrediting information about previous regimes become public? And to what degree is this a political process that is open to manipulation? And finally, there is this question of nostalgia and differing ways in which people provide a valuation of the past. As we have already suggested, when people talk about the past, and in particular when people make statements about whether the past was bad or good, very often what they are really doing is not talking about the past, but talking about their perception of the present. There is a further set of problems that arises in the general enterprise of trying to understand the post-socialist world, especially to the degree that we think about the post-socialist world as constituting some kind of unit of analysis. What are these? Well, we often hear people talk about the post-socialist world or post-socialist Europe. It raises the question, is there some sort of fundamental difference between post-socialist Europe and the rest of Europe? Is Are these really two separate categories? When we talk about this category of Eastern Europe, is this distinction between East and West meaningful anymore? If they are not, and if many of these differences are being dissolved now into a general process of globalization in which different parts of the world become similar, we have to ask, what does globalization mean? And is this also a periodized concept? That is, where were places before they were part of the globe? Were they a part of something that is not the globe? Is this something that is ontologically distinct? A further complication is raised by the fact that these distinctions are often proposed and advanced by analysts, academics, other intellectuals in the central parts, the economically and politically powerful parts of the global economic system. And so we have to raise the question of whether academic globalization, in particular the imposition of standards and ideas from the center to periphery, is a colonizing practice, whether their perception that people in the so-called core of the global system of knowledge in this case have very little to learn from people in the periphery, and if this perception is dominant, what does it mean and what does it prevent us from knowing? To the degree that we also insist on using the category of post-socialism, we can ask, is this an autonomous field of knowledge? Is there something about post-socialism that is so distinct from everything else in the world that we can turn it into a field of inquiry by itself? We also have to ask the question of determinism and of difference. If this post-socialist states are states in transition, states in transformation, does this mean that they are meant to become something? That is, we have to raise the question, if the implicit goal is that all states become liberal democratic states in the model of Western Europe or North America or something like that, are the states in the region that we're talking about not yet this thing that have been postulated, or will they never be? Are they simply not? Are they something else? And finally, we need to talk about the degree to which post-socialist states constitute a category. Is post-socialism one thing, or is it a condition that is shared in a very diverse set of environments that face different conditions and different issues? Or to raise the question in a material way, how similar are Poland and Kosovo if they are both post-socialist states? Let's talk, though, concretely about some of the things that happen when state socialist systems leave the scene and this new sort of market, whatever we might want to call it, develops. One thing that we can talk about is that there is a spread in through the process of privatization, both wild privatization, predatory privatization, semi-legal economic practices. Now, some informal practices and practices of corruption have their origins in systems of exchange that developed during the state socialist period, especially in practices that were developed in order to compensate for the shortage of materials and of services. And some of them are new in all of these societies, with the development of privately owned rather than publicly owned market being a major factor. You see large-scale emergence of organized crime, and I want to go into this in a little bit. This is going to sound like a digression to you, but I think perhaps it's not. I'm going to give you a formula that comes from probably one of the best sociological analyses of organized crime that's ever been written. That is the book The Sicilian Mafia by Diego Gambetta. And Diego Gambetta asks the question, how is it that this form of organization that we've come to label a mafia develops in the particular time and place that it did? That is, in Sicily in the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. And he dismisses a lot of common explanations. He says this is not a product of poverty. There are places where there is consistent poverty where this form of organization does not develop. These are the conditions that he identifies in Sicily that led to the creation of a mafia. That is, to this private system of enforcement of contracts. The first is that there is an increase in the number of transactions. So stable poverty does not produce the the emergence of organization of organized crimes, what happens is lots more people are making exchanges with one another. And if you consider that a lot of these exchanges involve, for example, food, people from the country bringing agricultural products to the city where they will be sold in markets as food. These are transactions between people who do not know one another and who do not trust one another. Okay, so these increase in the number of transactions happens within an atmosphere of distrust. And in this atmosphere of distrust, this is certainly typical of Sicily as Gambetta describes it, and we could also say perhaps of states undergoing transformations of their political and economic system. Legal and political authority are weak. Laws are not regularly enforced. The level of trust in institutions is low. The ability of institutions, their capacity to engender trust is also low. So if you want your contracts enforced, you cannot look to law enforcement, police, judges to do it. You have to look somewhere else. Where are you going to look? To a group of people who are trained in the use of violence and who are not subordinate to another force. Okay, these will either be criminals from another time or enforcers from another time. These factors will coalesce to make a mafia. Vadim Volkov talks about the development of organized crime in Russia in the 1990s, applying Gambetta's model, finds that it fits perfectly. I think you don't need to do a lot to talk about any of these post-socialist economies and see how the conditions of the creation of markets, particularly in relative isolation and peripherality, come together to create these conditions that Gambetta identified as the conditions that lead to the development of mafias. So that means that when we talk about corruption, when we talk about crime, we can talk about legacies of old types of corruption and old types of crime, things that are left over from the state socialist system, but probably also about the development of new forms of crime and corruption. Now, if we want to go to ex-Yugoslavia, this means that there are post-Yugoslav systems developed on the generation of private markets that are very heavily structured by different forms of patronage, use of connections, the emergence, and in some cases, the dominance of organized crime groups, what Gambetta identifies as mafias. Let me change gears a moment and talk a bit about nostalgia. That is, what do people think of the socialist period in the post-socialist period? And one of the things that you're able to see, in much of the world that used to have state socialist regimes, these regimes are rejected. They are dismissed. They are regarded as an historical aberration. This is less the case in the states and societies of Southeast Europe. There is, in fact, a lot of nostalgia for the state socialist period, and in particular for Yugoslavia, for a number of reasons. What are these reasons? Many of them probably don't have a lot to do with how good or bad the state socialist system is, but a lot of nostalgia, idealization of the past, is grounded not in what the past was like, but in dissatisfaction with what the present is like. There are expectations that are not met, and so an impulse to look back and say that it was better before. Similarly, you could say that a lot of extremism in the present, absolute rejection, ideological anti-socialism or anti-communism, or the presentation of political opponents as being ideological socialists or communists, these extremist approaches in political rhetoric and dismissal of opponents, is grounded in demonization of the past. So both the idealization and the demonization of the past have their origins in orientations to the present, and what you're able to see happening culturally, the way that that this becomes visible is in the way that the period of state socialism, of communism, is fetishized and aestheticized. And this is visible in expressions of unease about disappearance of the pasts and idealization of the past. It's visible in virtual emulations of the past, whether these are positive or negative emulations. This raises a question for us of whether nostalgia for the socialist period and the post-socialist period, does this represent genuine longing, or is it a negative reflex? Is it a kind of disguised critique of the present? What does this amount to when we talk about socialism and post-socialism? Let me offer you a middle-range suggestion for a conclusion, which is that the period of state socialism was a somewhat unique experience, which leaves some traces about which people have somewhat mixed feelings. We'll leave it at that, and I will look forward to discussing these questions with you in our live session.